Hello, everyone. Monday, April 25th, 2022, 4:24 p.m. Just had an email come across my inbox at 3:01 p.m. giving an update on the court case, the historical court case, the very important court case that all Catholics should keep an eye on, of the Diocese of Charleston versus Adams. And it's just a brief summary of what's going on. The Diocese of Charleston and the South Carolina Independent Colleges and Universities, Inc., filed a brief to the Fourth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals on April 19th. The brief requested oral arguments before the appellate court to review our lawsuit challenging South Carolina's Blaine Amendment. This is super, super important. It's important for so many reasons that I'm going to go through what the Blaine Amendment is, and then I'm going to read maybe all of the complaint. I'll see how long it is. Of what. So the complaint is the document that was entered into the court system, outlining what the allegations are by the plaintiff, who in this case is the Diocese of Charleston. So, in its most recent decision, the district court did not rule in favor of the diocese, and they believe that the district court erred in this decision since, through historical evidence and expert testimony, we have proven that religious and racial discrimination were the motivation behind the 1895 Blaine Amendment and its later revision in 1972. Presently, we are awaiting approval of our request for oral argument from the Fourth Circuit. Your continued prayers and support are needed for the end of religious and racial discrimination in South Carolina. All right, so check it out. I'm going to go through the complaint. So the complaint is the Bishop of Charleston, a corporation, sole DBA, the Roman Catholic Diocese of Charleston, and South Carolina Independent Colleges and Universities, Inc., versus Marcia Adams in her official capacity as the Executive Director of the South Carolina Department of Administration, and Brian Gaines in his official capacity as Budget Director for the South Carolina Department of Administration, and Henry McMaster in his official capacity as Governor of South Carolina. And so what had happened was, so I've been following this from the beginning because it directly affected me as having having two children in Catholic schools. So initially they had told us that we would, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we were going to be able to apply for vouchers to receive some emergency assistance for our tuition payments, because what happened was obviously the public schools were shut down. Our school, our Catholic schools, did not shut down. And so there were parents, number one, who wanted to keep their kids in Catholic school, but who were not working. I was one of those. Their jobs got shut down, so they were having no income. And so they were, panicking as to how they were going to pay tuition. So you had that on one hand. And on the other hand, you had parents of public school kids who wanted to transition their kids into the Catholic schools simply because the Catholic schools were open, and the private schools, it wasn't just the Catholic schools. I believe it affected the other Christian private schools, which is like a foreign concept to me, but there's like Protestant private schools here. It's so I don't understand that, but that's whatever. So anyway, and so there's the public school parents who had to go to work, who wanted to, put their kids in private school but couldn't afford it. And so we were told initially that we were going to be able to receive, apply for and receive these vouchers based on income or whatever. And then the state ended up saying no, that none of the emergency funds were going to be allowed for that reason. And so the Diocese of Charleston, it sued them and is going through this lawsuit. So here's what it says: complaint for declaratory and injunctive relief. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic ravaging our state and nation, and that this was filed in 2021, I believe, the U.S. Congress and South Carolina General Assembly have appropriated substantial sums of public funds to provide relief to local governments, employers, nonprofit organizations, schools, and colleges. However, because the South Carolina Constitution contains a provision, a so-called Blaine Amendment, which prohibits public funds from being allocated to private or religious schools, the schools and universities presented by plaintiffs are legally prohibited from accessing these relief funds. Because the Blaine Amendment was born in bigotry and prejudice based on race and religion, it violates the equal protection and free exercise clauses of the U.S. Constitution and should no longer bar plaintiffs' schools from equal access to these essential relief funds. Hence, plaintiffs bring this action under 42 U.S.C. 1983 to challenge the constitutionality of Article 11, Section 4 of the South Carolina Constitution, which states, "No money shall be paid from public funds, nor shall the credit of the state or any of its political subdivisions be used for the direct benefit of any religious or other private educational institution." Now, you have to remember, that seems like normal to us now, but at the time this was made, the only private religious schools, institutions, were Catholic schools. So they could have just put Catholic schools in there and it would have said the same thing. You have to remember, during that time, the public schools were Protestant. I mean, they were reading from the Protestant Bible and saying Protestant prayers. So while, again, it doesn't seem like it's that, discriminatory, it was born in discrimination. So this case asks this court to confront the ugly history behind South Carolina's Blaine Amendment and whether that prejudice is a permissible basis for a continuing policy whereby the state bars private schools and universities from participation in neutral grant programs when the state constitutional provision prohibiting private school participation is based on long-standing and pervasive religious and racial bigotry. And I want to read, because I'm just going to Google the Blaine Amendment real quick. It was actually, at one point, they wanted to put it into the U.S. federal constitution, but it was prohibited, but there was still... Let's see what Wikipedia says. The Blaine Amendment was a failed amendment to the U.S. Constitution that would have prohibited direct government aid to educational institutions that have a religious affiliation. Most state constitutions already had such provisions, and 38 of the 50 states have clauses that prohibit taxpayer funding of religious entities in their state constitutions. The measures were designed to deny government aid to patriarchal schools, especially those operated by the Catholic Church. So even Wikipedia gets it right. In locations with large immigrant populations. They emerged from a growing consensus among 19th century U.S. Protestants that public education must be free from sectarian or denominational control, while it also reflected nativist tendencies hostile to immigrants. The amendments are genuinely seen as explicitly anti-Catholic because when they were enacted, public schools typically included Protestant prayer and taught from Protestant Bibles, exactly, although debates about public funding of sectarian schools predate any significant Catholic immigration to the U.S. Thus, at the time of the Blaine Amendments, public schools were not non-sectarian or non-denominational in the modern sense, nor were they completely secular. And so this is why this is so important. And then I'm going to go back to reading the complaint. Okay. So what we have now in public schools, if you want to call them schools, I don't even know what they are. Drag queen story time, gender confusion, sex education is the direct result of the Protestant separation of church and state as described in the Blaine Amendment. This is why it's so important. So when you see on Facebook all your friends complaining about woke Disney, as Catholics, we have a duty to explain that one step further and make people, at least enlighten people, so they can try to understand the cause is that a vacuum was created. There's no such thing as secular. Okay, that's a lie of the devil. It doesn't exist. We're not in a spiritual bubble. There's no neutral grounds. It's either under the reign of Christ or under the reign of Satan. That's it. There's no in the middle. Okay, and so the Protestants, while in the beginning, okay, so let's even go back before that. Who invented the school system is obviously the Catholics, right? So the schools as we know it in the West was, a product of trying to educate kids. Or we don't even have to say that. Let's just, in America, It was initially schools were there to teach kids how to read and write, especially to teach them the Bible, things like this. And so as it developed, though, the Protestants who are fighting for separation of church and state run into a problem, right? They run into this problem because they hate Catholics so much that they don't want the Catholic Church running the schools because they don't want the church. So in order to get away from the church, they talk about separation of church and state while still saying Protestant prayers and reading from the Protestant Bible, which at that time they probably didn't consider. It was probably like a non-denominational thing. It was like the Bible-based churches, right, where they just that you go in and you hear the word of God or whatever. So I don't think there was like religious practices in a sense in the public secular schools, but it was, they were reading from the Bible, things like that, and saying prayers. And so what's hilarious to me is they kind of shot themselves in the foot. And it's not funny because souls are going to hell and I shouldn't laugh, but it's on full display right now. So the problem with, what they're trying to do, separation of church and state, as described in this Blaine Amendment, is now they can't even read their own Bibles in the school if they're going to stand by the separation of church and state. So what that has come to full fruition. That has grown up and matured, and it's a big, ugly monster of gender ideology, sex education, pedophiles having access to children, and all kinds of atrocities. The critical race theory, whatever else. Okay? So, but it all stems from this Protestant hate of the Catholic Church. That's where it comes from. So when your Protestant friends are getting mad about what the public school system has become, point them to the Blaine Amendment so they understand. You're part of the problem. Okay. Jurisdiction and venue. I don't need to read, but it's obviously under the jurisdiction of South Carolina Charleston Division. The parties, plaintiffs, and defendants. Factual allegations. This is going to give us, this was entered into court as South Carolina's history of religious and racial bigotry. The South Carolina Constitution of 1895, which included the state's original Blaine Amendment, was the product of one particular giant in Palmetto politics, Benjamin Pitchfork Ben Tillman. Following the Civil War, the state had adopted the Constitution of 1866 under the guidance of Reconstruction Republicans. Once Reconstruction had ended and Union troops had withdrawn from the state, Tillman set out to craft a new constitution that permanently protected white power with literacy requirements for voting and other racist policies. One of those racist policies was the Blaine provision which read, "The property or credit of the state of South Carolina or of any county, city, town, township, school district, or other subdivision of the said state, or any public money, from whatever source derived, shall not by gift, donation, loan, contract, appropriation, or otherwise be used directly or indirectly in aid or maintenance of any college, school, hospital, orphan house, or other institution." Now, who runs all of those? College, school, hospital, orphan house, or institution is the Catholic Church. It's so obvious that that's who they meant. "Society or organization of whatever kind which is wholly or in part under the direction or control of any church or of any religious or sectarian denomination, society, or organization." The provision reflected the ugly marriage of two prejudices: religious bigotry against immigrant Catholics then coming to America's shores, and racial prejudice against newly freed slaves whose lives, living conditions, and educational opportunities were being improved by religious missionary organizations. Oh, that evil Catholic Church. And it served an important Tillman goal. If the freed slaves and their descendants were cut off from private schools that might actually teach them to read, then they could never reach a critical mass of voters who could hurdle the literacy test blocking their access to the ballot box. So those were like what, the Jim Crow laws, I think they were called. Plaintiff SCICU includes among its membership 3 colleges founded by religious missionaries in the years shortly after the Civil War with the specific goal of educating freed slaves and their descendants. Allen College, founded as Payne Institute in 1870, Columbia, and renamed in 1880. Benedict College, founded as the Benedict Institute in Columbia, 1870, and Claflin University in Orangeburg, 1869. These religious colleges undermined Tillman's goals of suppressing African American education to ensure their status as a permanent underclass of menial laborers. In addition to Tillman's racism, which found widespread support across the convention delegates, another sordid wind was blowing across the country at the same time: anti-Catholic prejudice. After the Civil War, America began experiencing significant immigration from Europe's heavily Catholic nations, such as Ireland, Italy, and Poland. That's all three of what I am. And that's when my family came over here. Well, some of them. The Italians were a little bit later. A deep-seated distrust of so-called papists pervaded much of American society, which attitude was reinforced by a general skepticism of immigrants. So if you remember the first Catholic president, right, JFK, how did he get elected? Well, in part because he said, my Catholic views will not interfere, I'm paraphrasing, but will not interfere with my, duty as president. So the fact that even in the 60s, was it the 60s, I think, he had to make that point tells you everything that you need to know about America was never friendly to Catholics, ever. So the nativists' reaction against the immigrants found political expression in groups like the American Party, the American Protective Association, and the National League for the Protection of American Institutions. The anti-Catholic movement found its congressional champion in James G. Blaine, a member from Maine who sponsored the original Blaine Amendment, which would have amended the U.S. Constitution to prohibit any public aid to so-called sectarian institutions, when sectarian was code for Catholic. After the federal Blaine Amendment failed to pass by a razor-thin margin in 1875, so-called baby Blaine amendments were eventually adopted in greater than 35 states, including South Carolina. The historical record indicates that the American Protective Association and the National League for the Protection of American Institutions were active in South Carolina politics in 1895, lobbying the Constitutional Convention for a Blaine provision in the Palmetto State's new charter. The convention adopted a Blaine provision that closely mirrored the National Blaine Amendment, permanently prohibiting any state funds from reaching the diocese's various social service ministries or the historically black colleges that belonged to SCICU. The Tillman Constitution continued in force for more than 50 years until a group of young Turks led by then State Senator John West called for revisions to the 1895 Constitution. In 1966, the state impaneled the West Committee to review the 1895 Constitution. Though some of its members may have later advocated progressive views on race, two of its dominant figures were avowed defenders of racial segregation: the committee's secretary, William D. Workman Jr., and the all-powerful Speaker of the South Carolina State House, Solomon Blatt. The committee's final report was submitted to the General Assembly, which eventually placed it on the ballot for the people's approval in 1972. The General Assembly unpopular approval of the committee's overall revisions to the Constitution were also a product of the predominantly white segregationist political majority that dominated South Carolina politics during the Civil Rights era. The change in the provisions permit indirect aid to students, while still barring direct aid to schools, was made to allow for state-funded scholarships for students to attend private segregation academies. Thus, in 1972, the Blaine Amendment was revised to its present form, a section of the education article which now reads, "No money shall be paid from public funds, nor shall the credits of the state or any of its political subdivisions be used for the direct benefit of any religious or other private educational institution." A separate provision of the 1972 revision retained the prohibition on the credits of the state being used for private institutions. The Attorney General of South Carolina has issued opinions referring to the 1972 provisions as a Blaine Amendment. South Carolina federal funds and emergency relief for educational institutions. Congress passed the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act on March 27th. And so I think this is also very important to remember. We were denied federal funds, not by the federal government, but by the state. So there was that. On March 27th, 2020, the CARES Act provided, among other things, money for educational institutions and related businesses that were affected by COVID-19. The CARES Act created 3 separate funds, including the Governor's Emergency Relief Gear Fund, GEER Fund, which is relevant here. See CARES Act 18001B. Under the GEAR, the governor of a state may direct federal funds to provide emergency support through grants to local educational agencies that the state educational agency deems have been most significantly impacted by coronavirus, to support the ability of such local educational agencies to continue to provide educational services to their students, and to support the ongoing functionality of the local educational agency. 2. To provide emergency support through grants to institutions of higher education serving students within the state that the governor determines have been most significantly impacted by coronavirus, to support the ability of such institutions to continue to provide educational services and support the ongoing functionality of the institution. And 3, to provide support to any other institution of higher education, local educational agency, or education-related entity within the state that the governor deems essential for carrying out emergency educational services to students for authorized activities described in Section 18003D1 of this title or the Higher Education Act. The provision of child care and early childhood education, social and emotional support, and the protection of education-related jobs. GEAR funds are allocated to states based on the number of people between ages 5 to 24 in the state, as well as the number of students for each state counted under Section 1124C of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. South Carolina received $48,467,924 in GEAR funds from the Federal Department of Education. Though the funds are entrusted to the governor's discretion, the fiscal agent for the funds is the Department of Administration. The U.S. Department of Education certification and agreement for funding under the Education Stabilization Fund program, Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, signed by Governor McMaster, designated Defendant Gaines, an employee of the Department of Administration, as the state program representative. The office is authorized to receive federal and state relief funding as directed by federal law and to disperse funds as directed by the governor pursuant to law. To distribute a portion of these funds, McMaster created a grant program called Safe Access to Flexible Education, SAFE, under the SAFE Grant Program. Eligible families could apply for need-based grants up to $6,500 per student from 2020 to 2021, which I did apply for, academic year. Students could use the grant funds at any private or independent school that registered and met certain criteria regarding the impact of COVID-19 on its operations. After a student chooses the specific private school he wants to attend and is enrolled, the student's parent or guardian would use an online portal to direct the grant funds. The diocese planned for its 33 schools to participate in the SAFE program, including creating advertising and marketing materials for its schools to promote SAFE to families with students enrolled in patriarchal schools and those who might choose to move their children to the schools. The governor's distribution of the GEAR funds also included a program to help the 8 historically black colleges and universities in South Carolina. The program was designed to provide support for online learning. So they weren't even open. We were open. 6 of these HBCUs are private, and 5 of them are members of the plaintiff SCICU. After the governor announced the GEAR program, litigation was promptly filed in Orangeburg County State Trial Court challenging the SAFE Grants program under the Blaine Amendment. The trial court judge granted a temporary injunction against the distribution of the SAFE grants. Recognizing the broad reach of the South Carolina Supreme Court's order, the governor also stopped implementation of the HBCU grants. The Supreme Court of South Carolina certified the case in its original jurisdiction and struck down the SAFE program on the basis of the Blaine Amendment. Because of the court's decision, and so when all this was going on, we were urged to contact our representatives, and contact, our senators and representatives. And so I contacted, I think it was a bunch of them, but one of them I got back was Lindsey Graham. Oh man, he has to go. So he writes me this email. I'm sure he didn't write it. I'm sure it was, just one he drafted that got sent to everybody, about how he is a product of the public school system and he stands by the decision to not allow, money to go to private schools. And I'm thinking to myself, like, maybe you shouldn't say that you're a product of the public school system, because that's going to deter people from sending their kids to public school. Like, he was saying it like it was a good thing, and I'm like, what? Anyway, I'm not a Lindsey Graham fan. He needs a lot of prayers. The governor must announce his allocations for the funds by May 11th, 2021. All right, so the CARES Act also provided block grants that states could allocate internally in their discretion. South Carolina exercised its discretion through the General Assembly, which passed in 2020 Act 154 and included $115 million for state agencies, local governments, and higher education institutions to reimburse them for COVID-related costs. The Department of Administration, run by Defendant Adams, set up the application process for these Act 154 funds. The deadline to apply for those was November. After the Supreme Court's decision, Defendant Adams sent memorandum to South Carolina's private colleges and universities informing them that they would not qualify for funds made available to higher education institutions under the South Carolina General Assembly's Act. As of this filing, a substantial portion of these Act 154 funds remains in state accounts unspent. Let that sink in. Separately, Act 154 authorized $25 million for nonprofit organizations impacted by COVID. The statutory definition was broad enough to cover private and I'm saying that wrong. Patriarchal schools, sorry. Numerous other religious and nonprofit organizations received funds from this appropriation, but the Blaine Amendment prevented the diocese schools and other private and religious schools from accessing these funds. The United States Congress has adopted another round of COVID relief. America's Rescue Plan, the $1.9 trillion bill, includes substantial funds for states, such that the General Assembly could choose to adopt additional relief for nonprofits and universities. Because of South Carolina's Supreme Court's interpretation of the Blaine Amendment, the schools of the diocese and the members of SCICU are prevented again from accessing any relief. Claim for relief. We probably don't need to get into that unless there's something. The free exercise clause of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution is what they're invoking. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. They're saying the free exercise clause applies to states and their political subdivisions through the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. The free exercise clause prohibits laws that have as their intended object the suppression of free exercises, even if they appear facially neutral. Institutionalized educational ministries such as schools and universities and other evangelical ministries are part and parcel of a religious organization's free exercise of religion. The South Carolina Blaine Amendment is a law targeted at the suppression of religious educational ministries, namely Catholic schools and schools founded by Northern religious missionaries after the Civil War. And they're asking for it to go away. And it got shot down, so they're appealing it. And so here's what it boils down to in the year 2022. This is really what it is. I'll just break it down Barney style. The absolute failure of the Protestant idea of separation of church and state was born from, well, it was born really from the Enlightenment, but it was really adopted by the Protestants because they wanted nothing to do with the church. So, because of their hatred for the Church of God, we now have public funds paying for things like transgender people coming into the schools, um, the sex education, teaching kids about whatever, the pornographic books that are in these libraries and all this stuff. So that's what's being funded. But if you reject that, because it is a religion, okay, it's not secular, it's a religion. Their religion is Satanism, their religion is paganism. I understand it's harder to categorize because it doesn't follow a specific set of doctrines, but it's essentially paganism. Neo-paganism, I guess, is what you would really call it. And so, since it's harder to, I guess, identify because Satan lives in the shadows, that's what's being funded with our tax money. So, if you reject that and realize that, hey, like, the public school system is unfit for my Christian children, you have two choices. You can homeschool or you can send them to Catholic school, or private school, whatever, that is in line with your values. But understand, those are not going to be funded with taxpayer money. So the state is really deciding which side they're on with things like this Blaine Amendment. Even a conservative state like South Carolina, a red state. In my opinion, it's already starting to crumble anyway. While our little tiny Catholic school is thriving, I mean, it's small. It's only like 100 kids or whatever. But it's a thriving school as far as the learning, as far as the fruits that come out of that school, as far as the quality of children that come out of that school. I mean, I'll just give you an example. My daughter will go to, sleepovers or whatever with her friends. She's got like two really good friends, two little girls. And whoever's doing the sleepover will make sure they bring them to mass. If it's a Saturday night, these kids pray the rosary before bed. I mean, they exchange, they're constantly buying each other stuff. I was in the gift shop a couple weeks ago at our church, and my daughter's like, blah, 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 scapular broke. Can I buy her one? Like, they exchange scapulars, prayer cards, things like that. You're not allowed to get help for that. But if you want to send your kid to the diabolical public schools, that's fine. Those are funded. Those kids even all get free lunch. I mean, this is the level it's at, and it shows the absolute failure of Protestantism, the absolute failure of the separation of church and state. Failure. And it's all coming crumbling down because when you look at places like, when you look at this newest woke Disney, that started because DeSantis, who is a Catholic, I don't know if he's a good practicing Catholic, but I know he's a baptized Catholic, steps in and says, you're not going to teach little kids about this stuff or whatever. You're not going to groom them. And everybody can get behind that, but people are so shallow that they don't understand the root cause of the problem is stuff like the Blaine Amendment. This is where it started. And so I guess that's really just what I wanted to point out about, it's all going to come crumbling down because it's on full display. It's going to self-destruct like it is right now. Like, you're only going to get away. This is only going to continue for so long before sane people are like, this would happen. Well, this is what happened. So I hope we learn. I hope we learn our lesson. I do. I fear that we're not going to because there's still, even among the sane, still don't get it. They understand pedophiles in schools are bad, but they don't understand where it came from. They don't understand the root of the problem. So until we understand that the separation of church and state is a complete failure, and that Protestantism that has dominated America in the Christian sense is a complete failure, then we're not going to get it. It's not going to correct itself. It's just going to all come crumbling down, and then at some point, I guess, have to be rebuilt. I hope to God we try to rebuild it the right way. But these public schools are just, they have to be shut down. I mean, there's no way around it. And I think eventually it's going to crumble. I don't know when, but I know it's coming. The reckoning is coming. It can't go on like this. So anyway, just wanted to share that. I hope you found it interesting. And keep the Diocese of Charleston in your prayers. And again, this was called The Case, if you want to look it up for yourself. I'll post a link to the complaint below, but it's the Diocese of Charleston versus Adams. Hope you all have a blessed night. Joan of Arc Media out.